The year was 1961. The most powerful man in Hollywood stood up in a room full of 200 people and said that Natalie Wood was nothing more than a pretty face with no real talent. He said it casually, the way men like him said things, with the absolute confidence of someone who had never once been told he was wrong. He said it like it was a fact, like it was obvious, like the idea that the woman sitting 10 feet away from him might be something more than her cheekbones, and her studio contract was simply not worth serious consideration. What happened next lasted 4 minutes. Those 4 minutes changed the room, they changed the people in it, and they changed the way Hollywood's most powerful men looked at Natalie Wood for the rest of her career. But the story of those 4 minutes starts much earlier than 1961. It starts with a system designed to make sure moments like that one never happened at all. If you want the stories Hollywood tried to bury forever, subscribe to our channel. We bring you the truth that powerful people spent decades hiding. To understand what Natalie Wood said in that room in 1961, you have to understand what had been done to her in the years before she walked into it. Natalie Wood had been performing since before she could read. Her mother, Maria Gurdon, a Russian immigrant with iron ambitions and an unerring instinct for what the studios wanted, had placed her daughter in front of cameras at the age of 4 and spent the next decade engineering every aspect of Natalie's public presentation with the precision of a military campaign. By the time Natalie was 10 years old, she had already appeared alongside Orson Welles. By 15, she was under contract to Warner Bros. By 18, she was one of the most recognized faces in America. But recognition and respect are not the same thing. The studio system of the late 1940s and 1950s operated on a specific understanding of what a young actress was for. She was for looking beautiful in carefully lit photographs. She was for drawing audiences who wanted to watch something pretty move across a screen. She was for being managed, directed, costumed, and presented in whatever form the studio's marketing department had determined would sell the most tickets that quarter. Her opinions about her roles were not solicited. Her interior life was not considered relevant. Her intelligence was, at best, an irrelevance, and, at worst, a problem. The men who ran Hollywood in those years were not subtle about this. They held meetings that Natalie was not invited to, in which her career was discussed in terms that had nothing to do with craft or ability, and everything to do with how her face was photographing that season. They made decisions about her hair, her weight, her co-stars, her directors, and her private relationships, and communicated those decisions to her through intermediaries, as though she were a product being adjusted for market conditions, rather than a human being with a life she was trying to live. And Natalie Wood, who had been trained from infancy to smile and cooperate and give them exactly what they asked for, largely complied until she didn't. The turning point came in 1955, when Elia Kazan cast her in Rebel Without a Cause opposite James Dean. The film asked Natalie to do something the studios had never asked her to do before. It asked her to be real, to access something underneath the performance, to stop being pretty and start being true. What came out of Natalie Wood in that film surprised everyone, including Natalie herself. The performance was raw and specific, and emotionally precise in a way that could not be manufactured. It could only be found, and finding it changed something in her, not immediately, not all at once, but fundamentally and permanently. She began reading, not the scripts the studio sent over with instructions already attached, but literature, philosophy, psychology. She began attending lectures. She began asking questions in rooms where women were not expected to ask questions. She began forming opinions and, more dangerously, expressing them. The studios noticed, and the studios did not like what they noticed. The dinner was held in the private dining room of one of Beverly Hills' most exclusive restaurants. Late 1961. The occasion was a studio celebration, one of those events the industry regularly staged to congratulate itself. The kind of evening where the powerful gathered to confirm their power in the presence of people slightly less powerful who had been invited to serve as an admiring audience. Approximately 200 people were in attendance. Studio heads, directors, producers, actors of sufficient stature to warrant a seat at the table, the kind of gathering where careers were made and destroyed between the appetizer and the main course, where a casual comment from the right person could open doors and a casual comment from the wrong person could close them permanently. Kirk Douglas was, by 1961, at the absolute apex of Hollywood power. He had built that power through a combination of genuine talent and ferocious ambition that the industry recognized and rewarded. Spartacus had been released the previous year to enormous commercial success. He was a producer as well as an actor, a man who controlled his own projects in an era when most actors were still entirely dependent on studio decisions. He was physically imposing, professionally dominant, and socially accustomed to defining the terms of every room he entered. He defined the terms of this room in the way he defined most rooms, by speaking first and speaking loudly, and making it immediately clear that his opinion was the one that would organize the conversation around it. Natalie Wood was seated several places down the table. She was 23 years old. She had just completed Splendor in the Grass for Elia Kazan, a performance that would earn her an Academy Award nomination and that many critics would later describe as one of the finest pieces of acting in the decade. She had also recently finished West Side Story, a film that would win 10 Academy Awards and become one of the most celebrated musicals in the history of American cinema. She was 23 years old. She had done all of this, and she was still being treated in rooms like this one as though she were decoration. The comment came the way these comments always came, embedded in a larger conversation, delivered with a smile, wrapped in the casual confidence of a man who had never considered that the person he was talking about might respond. Kirk Douglas was holding forth about the nature of talent in the film industry, about the difference between genuine artistic ability and mere photogenic good fortune. He was making distinctions, drawing lines, and at a certain point, in a voice loud enough to carry down the table, he drew a line that placed Natalie Wood on the wrong side of it. "A pretty face," he said, "a studio creation, a girl who photographed well and hit her marks and let the directors and the lighting do the actual work. Talented." He paused in the way men like him paused when they wanted the room to understand the question was rhetorical, not particularly. The table went quiet in the specific way tables go. Quiet when something has been said that everyone understands is either a test or a mistake. Natalie Wood put down her fork. What Natalie said in the next 4 minutes has been described by everyone who was present in the same terms, regardless of whether they are telling the story 50 years later with admiration or with lingering discomfort. They describe it as precise, controlled, utterly without the performance of emotion that the room might have expected from a 23-year-old woman who had just been publicly diminished. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She did not appeal to anyone in the room for validation or support. She looked down the table at Kirk Douglas, and she began to speak. She started with his own work, not as an attack, but as a reference point, a shared text that the room could examine together. She talked about the craft of screen acting in terms that were specific, technical, and grounded in a depth of study that no one in that room had expected from the girl they had been watching on screens since she was 10 years old. She talked about the physical and psychological demands of emotional truthfulness on camera, about the difference between the kind of performance that comes from instinct and the kind that comes from understanding, about what it actually requires to make an audience believe something is real. Then she turned to her own work, not defensively, analytically. She walked the room through specific choices she had made in Rebel Without a Cause and Splendor in the Grass, choices that had nothing to do with her face or her hair or how the light caught her cheekbones, choices about where to put the weight of a line, choices about what to withhold and what to release and when, choices that any serious student of acting would recognize immediately as the product of genuine craft and conscious intention. She was not asking the room to like her. She was not asking Kirk Douglas to apologize. She was making an argument. A rigorous, evidence-based, intellectually serious argument about the nature of her own talent, delivered with the composure of someone who had been waiting for this particular conversation for years and had spent those years preparing for it. When she finished, the room was silent for a moment, that several witnesses later described as one of the most charged silences they had ever experienced in a professional setting. Kirk Douglas did not respond. Not because he had nothing to say. Kirk Douglas always had something to say, but because what Natalie Wood had just done was not answer an insult. She had dismantled an assumption, publicly, methodically, and in front of 200 people who would be talking about it for the rest of their careers. He picked up his wine glass. The conversation moved on, but the room had changed. The witnesses. The dinner was not reported in the press the following morning. Events of this kind rarely were, not because the press didn't know about them, but because the studio publicity machinery that managed what appeared in print had long understood that powerful men saying diminishing things about actresses and being corrected by those actresses was not a story that served anyone's interests. But the people in that room talked. They talked the way people in Hollywood have always talked, quietly, carefully, in the specific language of an industry where information is currency and the wrong word in the wrong ear can close a door that takes a decade to reopen. They talked about what Natalie had done, and they talked about how she had done it, and the way they talked about it revealed something interesting about the culture of the room she had sat in. Several of the men who were present described the moment with a specific kind of discomfort that was not quite admiration and not quite hostility, but occupied the uneasy space between them. They acknowledged that what Natalie had done was impressive. They acknowledged it in the way men of that era acknowledged capability in women they had underestimated, with a slight recalibration of language, a small adjustment in how they talked about her going forward, a grudging willingness to include her name in conversations from which it had previously been absent. What they did not do, not a single one of them, was confront the question of what it meant that the assumption had been made in the first place. The women who were present told the story differently. They described Natalie's 4 minutes not as impressive or surprising, but as inevitable, as the moment when something that had been building for years finally had a room large enough and a provocation specific enough to come out. They described the composure she maintained throughout, not as strategic but as hard-won, the composure of someone who has been practicing for that moment in private for a very long time. One actress who was present at the dinner, speaking to a journalist decades later, described watching Natalie's face in the seconds before she put down her fork. She said that what she saw was not anger, not even determination. She said what she saw on Natalie Wood's face in that moment was relief. Kirk Douglas did not invent the assumption he expressed at that dinner. He inherited it, absorbed it, and reproduced it with the confidence of a man who had never encountered serious resistance to it. Hollywood in 1961 operated on a foundational conviction that female stars were primarily aesthetic objects. Craft was a conversation reserved for male actors and male directors. When women demonstrated craft, it was noted as an exception rather than evidence that the general rule was wrong. This was structural, maintained in dinners like the one in 1961, in the casual comments that established what was true, and in the silence that followed from everyone who benefited from that truth going unchallenged. Natalie Wood had been navigating this structure since she was 4 years old, told in various ways that her face was her instrument and her cooperation was her professional obligation. She had watched careers stall, contracts evaporate, names disappear from the conversation with a speed that suggested coordination rather than coincidence, and she had spent years preparing, building an argument so airtight and a technique so undeniable that when the moment came, she would be ready. The dinner in 1961 was that moment. The immediate aftermath was quiet. The machinery of narrative management that kept Hollywood's internal power dynamics out of the press in 1961 was efficient and comprehensive. An incident at a private dinner involving a young actress and one of the industry's most powerful men was exactly the kind of story that machinery had been designed to suppress. But the impact was real. documented not in newspaper archives, but in the way the conversation about Natalie Wood shifted in the months and years that followed. Directors who had previously been dismissive began seeking her out for roles with genuine dramatic complexity. She was included in conversations about craft, from which she had previously been excluded. The recalibration was not total or immediate, but it was measurable. The room's understanding of what Natalie Wood was had shifted. Kirk Douglas never publicly addressed the incident. He gave hundreds of interviews over the following decades, spoke extensively about his career, and maintained the self-mythologizing confidence of a man who had spent his life treating his own perspective as definitive. He did not mention the dinner. He did not mention Natalie Wood's response. Natalie Wood received an Academy Award nomination for Splendor in the Grass the following February, her second nomination. The film's emotional center was her performance, raw, devastating, technically extraordinary in ways that even critics who had previously underestimated her were forced to acknowledge. The people who had been at the dinner understood what it meant. Confirmation that the argument Natalie Wood had made at that table was correct, that what she said about her own talent, delivered in 4 minutes to a room that had no expectation of hearing it, was true.